Okay, if everyone would like to sit down, we're going to begin. I'd like to introduce and welcome Jeannie North, who is our third week speaker. Jeannie has been connected here at St. Francis for 20 years and is known to most of you who are here today. And I know Jeannie has some friends here also that have come for tonight. And in terms of the work that Jeannie will be talking about, she has spent about 40 years doing cancer, working with children with cancer and bereavement support and care. And she brings with her a tremendous amount of experience and love, and is here to share with us as we look at the theme of new beginnings. We all come to a certain time in our life that we have to face certain realities, and it is a new beginning. So Jeannie North, welcome, and come on. Later on, if you have any questions, I will run around with the microphone so you can not only have other people hear you, but so the recording will be able to hear you.
Thank you. It's kind of like old home week for me to be here and see so many of you that I know and remember, and you still have me back, which is really, really nice. But I was telling Warren and Annette that it seems strange for me to drive in here without Wayne. And, so that was different for me. But as soon as I walked in the door and got so many hugs, it seemed okay. So I was fine coming here. And thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. When Warren asked me how many years I've been doing this, and I started to add them up, I thought, oh my gosh, I'm really old. So bear with me. Here I am. So I spent over 20 years at the Pediatric Oncology Nurse Counselor at Phoenix Children's Hospital. And I was the director of the counseling programs for the kids who were treated for cancer there, as well as for their families, for the parents and the siblings. And we provided one-on-one support groups, and support throughout diagnosis, throughout treatment, throughout long-term care, as well as terminal care if that needed to be as well. When I began my career in the early 80s at the Cancer Center, 45% of our patients survived their disease. When I retired in 2002, nearly 90% survived. We've come a long way in treating pediatric cancer, and that's the good news. Everything I learned about life and living, I learned from kids, and you can too. Many years ago, when I was first working at the Cancer Center, and when hospice first began in the U.S. using volunteers, a friend of mine, Luann, convinced me that I should join her as a volunteer hospice nurse in my spare time. So, looking very professional, I donned a navy blue skirt and top, and I accompanied her to one of her clients' homes for my first introduction to hospice. Her patient was a 36-year-old mom with metastatic brain cancer, and this patient had two very young boys whom Luann had been visiting. They lived with their grandparents. Luann had been spending time with the boys, as well as the mom and the grandparents, gently, kindly, and compassionately helping them through the process of acceptance of the impending death of their mom. When we got there, we rang the bell, and the 7-year-old boy answered the door, turned around and hollered, "Hey, Grandma, the deaf ladies are here." Oh my God. Needless to say, Luann and I looked at each other, smiled, and forever referred to each other as the deaf ladies. But when you think about it, what a great job she had done in making these young boys comfortable with death being a part of their life, and with us being the deaf ladies coming to visit. I also ceased wearing dark colors to any hospice visits. So being your resident death lady, today I'm going to talk about death, something that's inevitable for all of us, either our own death of a loved one, either our own or the death of a loved one. Inherent in talking about death is also talking about loss, grief, and mourning as well. So let's begin with loss. There are many things in life that constitute loss. The loss of good health, the loss of a body part, the death of a loved one, the death of a pet, a divorce, moving away, a friend leaving, etc. Perhaps each of you can think of different losses in your own lives. Loss is universal, as is the resultant response, grief. Loss crosses all barriers, age, race, culture, sex. All people in all cultures experience loss in various forms. Loss is both a real event and a perception. The identical situation can happen to two people, and both may react to it differently. A friend of mine's husband died, and she immediately started baking cookies, cakes, pies for weeks. Another husband died, and she wouldn't get out of bed for weeks. Two different reactions to the same type of event. One person may view death as a relief from suffering, and one may view it as an unbearable loss. When my dad finally died at 92, my brother and I were relieved that he was no longer suffering. My mom felt an incredible loss of her loving partner and touchstone of nearly 60 years. Religious beliefs and cultural beliefs enter into the response. I'll talk more about this when I talk about my little patient and friend, Ramya, from India. Stuff going on in our personal lives and own losses enter into the responses as well. That's sort of self-explanatory. Past losses enter in, as loss is cumulative. Each loss carries with it past losses, as well as the threat of additional losses. Let me repeat that. Each loss carries with it past losses, as well as additional losses. When my husband died, our granddaughter struggled with memories of her husband's death just 4 years before. He was only 26. His death was a tragedy. Wayne's death was part of life. She also said to me, "Nana, you better not die." So she was anticipating my loss as well, and my death as well. The nature of a relationship impacts the nature of the loss. There's a saying, death ends a life, but not a relationship. Death ends a life, but not a relationship. Again, that's self-explanatory. Grief is the normal response to any loss. Grief, by definition, is making real inside the self an event that has already occurred outside or in reality. Grief is making real inside the self that has already occurred outside or in reality. Our society, unfortunately, often treats grief as though it were a self-indulgence. It is, in fact, a psychological necessity. Grief is the internal thoughts and feelings that we have when someone dies. There is no time frame to grieving no stages of shock, denial, anger, guilt, depression, acceptance, resolution, or the like that all people go through. You may experience some of them, you may experience all of them, or none of them. Each person's grief is unique. Grieving is a process. You must allow yourself to be naturally wherever you are in that process. Just as grief has no timetable, it doesn't adhere to any societal expectation. Grief for each person goes at its own unique pace and is dependent upon three things: the intensity of the grief, societal pressure, and death itself. The intensity of the grief is in direct proportion to the intensity of the relationship. The size of the grief corresponds with the depth of the love shared. Think of the intensity of the grief of a parent losing a child. That's huge. Think of the loss of a spouse of 60 years. That's also huge. Societal pressure. The outside world stops grieving with you. This is also huge. Others don't walk in someone else's shoes and often don't understand why someone would still be grieving after so long. Experiencing the loss of support from society and feeling like it's not okay to keep grieving or having to put on a good front is exhausting for someone who's grieving. The death itself is important. Was it sudden? Was it expected? Was it traumatic? What was the age of the person who died? That makes a difference in how people are grieving. Let me share the story about one of our patients, a little girl from India. Her family was from India. Ramya was a 5-year-old leukemia patient from India. A beautiful, funny, bright little girl who would always play word games with me when she came into the clinic for her treatments. She would choose a word, car, and she wouldn't choose the word car, and she would choose automobile. She was 5 years old. She wouldn't choose fish, but she would choose porpoise. And she would be able to spell them correctly. I couldn't spell them correctly. You get the idea. Unexpectedly, Ramya relapsed from her leukemia, and sadly, she died suddenly in the hospital late on a Sunday night. I helped arrange for her parents to take her body home to prepare her for the for cremation at the mortuary chapel. They had certain things that they had to do to her body with oils and preparations with dressing and things like that. I had to clear this request with both the hospital administration and the mortuary at 2 a.m, which was no small task, but it was accomplished. That was a little above my job description as well. Her dad asked me to bring as many roses as I could to the chapel at the mortuary in the morning, as the ceremony had to be at 9, so that the cremation would be before noon the next day. I brought 6 or 8 dozen roses from a local florist that I knew well, and I got her out of bed as well. I took them to the chapel where Ramya's body was lying on a soft mattress on top of a gurney. She was dressed in a stunning Indian dress with gold threads throughout. She had many small bracelets on and a gold headband in her hair as well. There was soft chanting music playing, and I joined her family and a few friends, mostly all from their Indian community. And we covered her body in rose petals as we circled her beautiful body on that where she was lying. And the family and friends were softly murmuring songs and prayers in Hindi, their native language. After the music subsided, her dad, her brother, her grandfather, and some of the men gathered there, and the extremely kind and accommodating owner of the mortuary gently carried her from the chapel to the crematorium. The women and I sat in the chapel on the bench, held hands, and whispered Hindu prayers. I prayed to whatever Hindu gods they were praying to. I prayed that Ramya was at peace, and that the love that her family shared would give them peace and strength to endure the loss of this beautiful, beautiful child. 2 weeks later, her grandfather took the ashes to India to cast them on the waters of the Ganges River, as is the custom, and to ensure Ramya a happy, eternal life. I made frequent visits to Ramya's family for several months after her death, and then they slowly went about their lives. 2 years later, I got a call when I was making rounds at the hospital, and it was Ramya's dad. I had to come right away as her mom was in the hospital and needed me. I rushed to the hospital as she was at, which was about 15 minutes away, and up to the room that he had indicated. I entered, and there stood Ramya's dad, her older brother, and her grandparents. Her mom was in the bed holding a newborn baby. Her dad tenderly lifted the baby from his wife's arms and gently placed him in mine and said, "Jean, this is Ramya reincarnated. Now you have completed the circle of life with us." As tears silently flowed throughout the room, mixed with smiles, I gazed down into that precious baby's eyes and knew that he was truly Ramya incarnated. Life goes on. Ramya's family had begun to heal. To heal in grief is to become whole again, to integrate your grief into yourself, and to learn to continue your changed life with fullness and meaning. Experiencing a newness and wholeness requires that you engage in the work of mourning. It doesn't happen to you. You must do the difficult work to help yourself. Healing is hard work. To mourn is to heal. Mourning is when you take the grief you have inside and express it outside yourself. You go public with it, or it's the outward expression of grieving. Talking about the person who has died, crying, expressing your thoughts and feelings to others, and finding compassionate listeners who will walk with you through your grief journey as you mourn. Healing encompasses all areas of your life: physical, emotional, spiritual, social, intellectual. You cannot cure your grief, but you can heal your grief. An emotional wound takes a lot longer to heal than a physical wound. Healing in grief takes time. You don't heal from the loss of a loved one because time passes. You heal because of what you do with the time. What can you do with your time? You can join a grief therapy group. You can see a grief therapist. You can write down your feelings each day as they change each day. Go for long walks. Find solace in God's house, wherever that is for you. Sit outside, just listen to the quiet. Embrace the memories, both good and not so good. Be with supportive friends and family. Drink tea, a lot of it. Drink wine, not so much of it. Maybe invest in Kleenex stock. Many of you know that my husband Wayne died a year and a half ago. So I too have lived what I've been talking about. I have spent the last year and a half grieving, mourning, healing. I've written my feelings down so much I have writer's cramp. I've walked 1,000 miles, many of them at the labyrinth here at on the church grounds. I've spent hours sitting in Madeira Canyon talking with God in the wilderness. I've had a gazillion sessions with a kind, compassionate, and skilled therapist. I've drunk untold cups of tea and or sometimes a glass of wine, depending on the time of day, with dear friends and family who've listened and listened and listened and enfolded me in the warmth of their love. I often sit on my patio and watch the sunrise over the Santa Ritas, and as the sun filters through the delicate leaves of the mesquites surrounding me, I think about all the times that Wayne and I shared together, both good and not so good. Do I believe that Wayne will be reincarnated like my little friend Ramya? Perhaps. Do I believe I will be with him again when I die? Perhaps. But what if Paul Newman's up there and wants me? I miss Wayne. I do know what it means when I think of the adage, death ends a life, but not a relationship. I know that I still grieve, I still mourn, but I am also at peace. Peace for me is the evidence of the blessings in life, family, friends, community. That human-to-human contact, which gives knowledge that life is good, human-to-human caring is the most important support in healing. I know that in the midst of the pain and turmoil, there's a kind hand that reaches out, a smile, a warm hug. I look up and there is sun in the trees, birds singing, snow on the mountains, blue sky, and fluffy clouds overhead. Life goes on. Thank you. Any questions? Sam?
I know that Wayne was a Stephen minister also, and I think just trying to bring in how Stephen ministry can help somebody through this journey also.
Thanks, Sandy.
Anyone else like to ask any questions or make any comments on what Jeannie has been sharing with you?
Jeannie, I can't tell you what it meant to be in your grief support group and how it helped me. I still have the papers that you gave us, and I still remember the roses that you gave after. And I can't tell you how much I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Cheryl.
No, it was lobby.
I'm wondering if the feeling that someone is still with you, if after many years. And and even feeling like you can converse with them. Is that something that is generally happens?
I think that often happens, Bobby, and that's real. That's very, very real, because there's an intensity in a relationship always, and that intensity stays with you, and so that often happens. That feeling of someone being with you, and it gives adage to that saying, death ends a life, but not a relationship. Mm-hmm. So,
Jeannie, can you share the story of that child who tried to push people away? I think the mother and others, by being mean to that, like acting mean, and there was a purpose for it, because it helps to understand how those who are going through their own death or facing death, how they react and how.
I'm not sure which story you mean. I have a gazillion stories,
Okay.
but I did have a little girl in the hospital who was being very, very mean to her mom.
Yes, that's the one.
And the mom was just really hurting so badly. And one day I went over to the hospital to do rounds, and the mom came out of the room and she said, I just have to leave and go down to the cafeteria. Can you spend time with her? And I said, of course. And she was maybe 8 years old, 10 years old. And so I sat on the bed, and she said, I suppose you want to know why I'm being mean to my mom. And I said, well, you are being kind of mean to her. And she said, well, I figure if I'm mean to her now, she won't miss me so much when I'm gone. And that was a child's thinking, and I said, well, your mom is going to miss you whether you're mean to her or not. And I think for her to have good memories with you is going to be a way for her to keep you in her heart a little easier than if she has all of these memories of you being mean. And she just kind of thought about that. And that kind of changed her behavior some. So there are just so many stories of kids that I worked with. And like I said, the good news was that 90% of our kids survived their disease by the time I left the cancer center. And yes, we still do lose kids from cancer, but the research and the treatments are so much better now that kids do survive. But they deal with it so much better. They're just amazing when they get a diagnosis. The parents have a really tough time, as you can imagine, and it's understandable. But the kids are, okay, bring it on. I'm going to deal with it, and, I'll go back to school. One little girl came into the clinic, and she said, I just can't believe it. I go to school all the time. My friend won't go to school if she has a zit on her nose, and I go to school without hair, for gosh sake, So, she just, that's how kids are, So it's good. Yeah.
Talk about the difference between men and women, how they mourn and grieve.
The difference between men and women, how they mourn and grieve, and I just think our society has done men a disservice in not being able to be in touch with their feelings. So the men that have been in my support groups over the years have been amazed at having feelings sometimes. So once they're in touch with the feelings of grieving, then they're in touch with the feelings of mourning. So then there's not much difference in how they mourn and how they grieve. But they have to first know those feelings. But I think that it comes down to the difference in how society reacts. And, men having to be strong and not cry and not be in touch with that. Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah. Yes, in the back, more.
What I found is that it's important to use the words death and dying. When I was working with a second grader, anyway, his brother had died, who was a fourth grader, and it'd been a year, the previous year, he'd started second grade, and everyone was using the word his brother had passed on. Well, when it came to the end of the school year, and they said, oh, you're going to pass on to the third grade, and he broke out into tears. I don't want to pass on, And so I think it's real important that we use those real words of death, dying, because children especially interpret them a whole lot of different ways.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's a really, really good point. And of course, I always use those words, death and dying, but so many people use euphemisms and use passed on or passed over or gone to a better place or whatever. And that's a really good point. Yeah, thanks for bringing that up.
Jeannie, what could you suggest for people who know someone whose husband, wife, child, someone has died? Over my years, some of the biggest sort of pastoral issues I encounter are people who have had a loss and they can't understand why life continues beyond them, but they're still in the middle of it. And you talked a bit about that when you first started. People don't know what to say. And they sometimes get to a point after maybe a month or so goes by, they forget so-and-so lost a husband, lost a wife, or whatever. And they just don't know what to do. They don't know what to say. They don't know how to act. And it hurts the one who is grieving. Right. Would you suggest if you were going to counsel other people who know of someone who's lost?
What do you say?
Yeah. What would you suggest in terms of words or actions or?
I think the best thing you can say is, I understand this is very hard for you, and, I'd like to support you. How can I support you? If you haven't been there, don't say, I know this is tough, because you don't know how tough it is for anybody else. But how can I support you? And, I understand this must be very hard for you. And I'd like to be there in however I can help. And show me or tell me what I can do to help. So with each individual it's different. But people grieve and people mourn for a long time. And it just depends on the intensity of the relationship. And you don't ever get over it. You go through it. But you continue to go through it for a long, long time. Yeah.
Jeannie, what do you tell people that are stuck in it, that just can't move on?
That's a tough one, Cheryl. People who are stuck, Cheryl asked, what do you tell people who are stuck in it or that can't move on? Then they're in need of more additional help, and it's not a quick fix. So you try to gently help them know that you're there for them in whatever way is helpful for them. But you don't know what's inside them. You don't know why they can't move on or won't move on. Some people want to stay stuck in it, and so you don't know why, and there may be underlying reasons why they might want to be. So that's a tough one.
Thank you.
Yeah. Sandy.
With our with our healthcare becoming so much more global and we have so many different cultures here in the United States, how do the palliative care groups, do they divide that up like, that looking at particular cultures that they approach death and dying in different ways?
It would be nice if they did. I don't know that they do because I'm not really in tune with a lot of the different palliative care groups, but I would hope that they would research a culture and what those cultural beliefs are before they provided that support, I pretty much knew what Ranya's family believed. I pretty much knew what the Hindu culture believed and what they did. So I was able to support them in the way they needed to be supported. I don't know that today in our rushing society to get through everything, if they do that. And I would hope that some people would be sensitive to that.
I guess it'd be hard if some people want to have more care still going on, but not really ready for total hospice.
Right.
That they are, hospice can be very long or it can be less than a day, that people
right.
get home. It's best to start early.
Right, yeah. Yeah, so it's complicated. It can be very complicated, yeah. B. Wait for the mic. I can't.
I just want to say that there's a very big difference between, I don't know how quite to say this. My husband died and it took a year, and I grieved throughout that year. Maybe not openly, but it was a long year. And then I have friends whose husbands have died immediately. And there must be such a difference in how you grieve that year long, and then almost immediately you have to grieve.
And again, it gives credence to how everybody's grief is unique. And everybody grieves differently, and there is no right or wrong way to grieve. And so it's different for everybody, B. And again, there is no right or wrong way to grieve. So it's an okay thing.
So Kubler-Ross's buckets don't really, you don't go from one to the other to the other.
Right, yeah, it just goes differently. Yeah.
Well, Kubler-Ross was really more about dying than grieving.
Kubler-Ross was more about dying, the stages of dying as opposed to the stages of grief.
Right, and Kubler-Ross did some significant work in dying and grieving, but she gave the impression that we all did different steps in, the acceptance and and we went to acceptance and we were fine. But we aren't, and it was fluid, it wasn't steps. And you go back and forth and back and forth. And it gave people the impression that, gee, I was here and now I'm way down here, I'm not okay. But you are okay, and you can go back and forth, and you're okay. It's a process. It's not steps of the way you go. Yeah.
Anyone else? Okay. Well, Jeannie, thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.